You don't feel so powerful. You often feel like you're trying to please those up above who are expecting you to drive results. They feel restrictive. They feel uncomfortable. You're trying to jam yourself into them. If you don't follow up with someone, you say you're going to do something, they'll fill that silence with the worst case scenario. This is real human instinct, even if...
Ashley Hurd is the founder and CEO of Manager Method and the author of the Manager Method. She is also an author at Hay House Inc., LinkedIn Learning Instructor, contributor at Fast Company, advisor at Bereave. She is a former Associate General Counsel at McKinsey & Company and former Director of Legal at KFC US, helping organizations turn new managers into confident, effective leaders.
I do have a framework that's pause, consider, act. Sometimes speed seems prioritized at the sake of just taking a pause.
What's your advice for those of us who spin too many plates and have a continual background noise of small amounts of crockery crashing to the floor?
A big part of the book is really communication, and some of this is...
Ashley, welcome to The Power Between.
Hello, Roddy. So good to be here.
It's really exciting to have you with us. A guest from other side of the Atlantic. We haven't had many of those, but a couple, but not many. And you are, amongst other things, an author. You're just about to publish your book, The Manager Method, which we will clearly talk about in the next few minutes. But you've got a big focus on middle managers, which is very much where The Power Between is keen to focus and shine a light on. So why don't you introduce yourself a little bit and why you've got an interest in that area and where that's come from?
I really like the idea of the power between. So I love the name for the podcast because I do like the idea of the power, and those listening may not always feel so powerful. And that's often where something that I've seen across industry. I've worked at organizations from KFC through McKinsey consulting firm and others in between, and have just seen constantly this challenge of middle managers is you don't feel so powerful. You often feel like you're trying to please, those up above who are expecting you to drive results, and you're trying to drive results by people that you don't understand what they're doing half of the time. And so it can feel incredibly challenging. And so I love the framing of having power, but having options of what to do and say in situations to help to drive those results, but also do it in a way that doesn't drive people out the door. That's what I've taken, again, from my career as a lawyer. So I've seen some of the worst things that can happen, but also in HR, supporting leaders at all level of the ladder, but especially focusing on those middle managers.
That's great. And I suppose I don't talk about the title very often, but that's absolutely was the thinking behind it, is there is a lot of power vested in the middle of organizations. And yet, if you're in the middle of organization, you often don't feel that you've get a handle on it very much. But it's perhaps more of a collective power that happens. I reference quite often the comment given to me by a senior and experienced non-executive director and former CEO who said, it's the people in the middle who the senior leaders are most fearful of losing. And it's because the people in the middle have that knowledge and that capacity to make things happen when everything seems to be falling apart, that probably the people at the top don't have. They don't know where the tools are and what to do in the moment. So there's a lot of power there. And I think what would be great is if we can leverage that and expand it and make people who have that power more aware of it in a positive way. So it makes them feel that they're more purposeful in what they do. You mentioned 3 job roles there. A lawyer, so that I presume you trained as a lawyer, but you also mentioned KFC and McKinsey, which I not a couple of organizations one often hears of in the same phrase. Tell me just a little bit about the order of those appearing in your career.
Well, I went to KFC and then McKinsey, so that's the order there. But first, I went to law school. I actually worked in corporate sales for 2 years out of college. So in the U.S., it's a bit different than it is in some other countries. So I went to college. I got a degree in international studies in Spanish. And then I worked for 2 years for a company that was eventually acquired by Gartner. Basically, I cold called CFOs to start with. And so I had a liberal arts degree, had to really quickly get a Fortune magazine and learn some of these terms. But so I ended up deciding to go to law school. At that time, I'd been promoted to the program that was for heads of HR. It's called the Corporate Leadership Council. And I got very interested invested in research that was all about what drives employee engagement. Even though I was on the sales side, I got really into, I've always kind of had this research brain. And a lot of that is about what really drives people at work. So, middle level, senior level management, this is the idea of the people that are doing the work. And it was all about the number one driver being if someone's direct manager explains to them why your role matters, how it impacts the success or failure of the organization, but when you do a good job, why that matters. And to me, it was so fascinating. I'd never heard of these things like strategy. I was 23. And so I went into employment law because all these heads of HR I was meeting with told me, go to employment law, you'll never be at a loss for work. Especially in the States, we are very litigious. And so I worked with employers on unemployment defense and counseling to prevent lawsuits. And what I constantly saw was whether lawsuits involve someone at the top organization, middle, often it was managers. And while sometimes there are examples that those people should not manage a paper bag, it was frequently gaps in conversation. So it was someone was let go from employment. The company says, well, it was for performance. You look at their performance review, they got 30 days, 60 days before they were let go, and it's a glowing review. And so the managers often will say, oh, well, I didn't want to feel mean. I didn't want to give that feedback. Mid-level managers haven't had training necessarily on how you deliver that kind of feedback. And so that's what I saw. That was, it certainly was job security for me as a lawyer and then going into HR. But what I saw is so often people do not get training on how the impact of how you work. So not just what gets done, but how people feel at work really impacts those things like performance, engagement, retention that, the boards of directors are all and shareholders are all gunning for. Often those come down to whether someone feels like they can have an open conversation with their manager, or when that, VP of a business unit comes in and someone presents their idea, if they're going to be listened to or if they get shut down in the moment. And so I worked in law firms, but then I'd worked in-house, which is meaning, advising directly. And again, I just continued to see this gap in communication in that even senior partners at McKinsey, who were constantly some of the most brilliant and well-trained individuals, but oftentimes when you talk to them, they would listen to my guidance. And I have no Ivy League degrees. I do have a law degree and an undergrad degree, but not from the most notable organizations. But they would listen and want my ideas on how to have conversations. And to me, I realized the power of that level of training. So I wanted to start my business manager method and write this book for literally all levels of the organizational ladder, because I think people have a lot more challenges in common than they realize.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, it's really interesting, isn't it, that how we fail to put any training into that sort of people management leadership that is absolutely core to most people's jobs, either because you're being people managed yourself or you're having to do it to others. And there's masses of research out there that show that it's the manager-employee relationship that dictates productivity levels, energy levels, engagement levels, and whether people stay in organizations or leave organizations. So it's crucially important. And yet we seem to think that it's something that you just learn to do, and you learn to do it well. Whereas the truth of the matter is, while it's not, and I say this almost every podcast, while it's not rocket science, it does need to be thought about and attended to. So I think it's really important to have these kinds of instructions, and the manager method is a great new addition to the work around that. And we know there are lots of books on leadership, and there's lots of books around that stuff, but we need to keep on bringing out more stuff, more reflections, more perspectives, because that's the way it gets to people. So fantastic. So when did you, the book comes out in the middle of February 2026, which is about when the podcast goes out. So for the listeners, it should be available to you now. When did the idea to write it first start?
Well, it's funny you say that. No one's asked me that ever, but I recently was thinking, when did I start thinking about this? And I found files in my personal computer going back to 2014 with some of the same principles that are in this book today. And I thought, certainly I didn't have things about AI in 2014. I wouldn't be writing a book. I would be in Tahiti, retired. But some of these principles about having conversations and then taking notes, and throughout the years, I would take notes to myself or send myself emails, and including things like, senior partners, so similar to restaurant manager. Sometimes I look back at these notes and I'm not exactly sure what I was trying to tell myself, but I thought about it because I started my business, which was about manager training, leadership development, including at the mid-level and senior leadership level. But I started posting videos on TikTok a few years ago. I was over 40 when I started this TikTok account. I look back at some videos I posted then, and I cringe. Anyway, but I started doing these leadership tips, and some of it I started doing videos to a fictional CEO, and some of them were from very real situations I've seen. Others are from things I'd hear constantly, but things like if someone returns to work again in the States. We don't have very long parental leave, if any, and so maternity leave, one thing is women pumping at work. This is a huge, huge topic, so I've made videos on that and just got these wild reactions. And so I was just doing things that to me felt like common sense, conversations I'd have with leadership. And over time, I ended up building a following, and that really helped with the book. Now with book publishing and development, I've learned like the marketing aspect of it is incredibly important, and having the social media audience. I was going to actually publish the book on my own when Hay House, my publisher, had reached out, and I went through their process to go through consideration. And I will tell you, it is humbling in the true sense of the word to have everything you do picked with like a fine-tooth comb and, what's your plan to be successful? So I do hope people like it. It's had a good reception from those that have read it. But ultimately, it's this idea of I've read a lot of leadership books. I love them. But so much of it sometimes is about theory. And you move on with life and you learn a lesson, you move on with life, and you don't really bring it into your work. And so for me, I do have a really unique, I call it career quilt of the different experiences I've had. But I've had audiences, and I will treat people exactly the same, whether they are, someone applying to be a receptionist at an organization versus a tenured CEO. I think everyone has the same, respect. And I think at the end of the day, the challenges that people have of fear of being embarrassed themselves, of fear of failure themselves, of fear of having mean conversations with people or disappointing others. And so really bringing that to a practical framework, but then all sorts of examples of how you can bring that to life as a leader.
No, I mean, that resonates absolutely. I mean, as a publisher myself, I particularly hear what you're saying around the marketing, because I spend a great deal of time telling our authors that writing the book is the pleasurable part for most of them, and lots of them, because they're consultants or academic faculty or whatever, are probably more on the introverted end of the scale than the extrovert end of the scale, and the idea of them going out and selling is awful for them. And I say, well, this is where the hard work begins. You've done the fun part of writing it, but so that's true. And also that gestation period. I think that's what it takes, though. You've got to have that urge to start writing, and then it comes together over the years. But in this sector, in this topic area, we're talking about people behavior, and people behavior doesn't change hugely. What motivates us and drives us is going to have been the same in 2014 when you were thinking about it as it is now, as it was in 1914, probably 10, 14, and just 14. And that's part of the issue, I suppose, is that people don't change very much, whereas the context around us does. As you mentioned, AI wasn't on your list at that stage. But you highlight lots of great things, and you say your career quilt brings you lots of different insights. And obviously the frontline people at KFC are going to be quite different from the frontline people at McKinsey. But there's the great sort of analogy that you put in about leadership styles and tight jeans versus oversized sweatpants. Talk us through that one, because that creates a great visual image of nothing else.
I came up with this idea of tight jeans managers. What I mean by that is strip away that we're listening to the Power Between podcast about leadership. Imagine that you are going, got to get some trousers, got to get some pants, and you go and get a pair of blue jeans straight out of the dryer. And I do not mean stretch jeans. Tight jeans. And let's say you've just had a full meal, you go to put those on, like, ugh, what's your thought? A lot of words I won't say on your family-friendly podcast, Roddy, but they feel restrictive, they feel uncomfortable, and it's just, you're trying to jam yourself into them. That's really the feeling that a lot of people have if you work toward what a lot of people say is a micromanager. And again, those can appear at all levels. You can be a mid-level manager and your EVP, your CEO can have that tight jeans effect that all of a sudden that is a very real analogy to you. That's not something that just happens for brand new managers. And what I see by this is this idea of, the managers that are they're all over you. They tell you how it needs to get done. They're on you, on you, on you. And the impact often to team members, including managers, is you're often trying to, do whatever it takes to not get embarrassed, not lose your job, but no more than that. You're not going to be speaking up because you don't want to get, ridiculed, or you don't want to look wrong, and you're just trying to follow the directions and not try new things. That often is at a loss for the organization. And also what I see by that isn't leaders that are having a bad intent, like a tight jeans manager, a tight jeans leader. What I see often is one that it just comes from that very, very similar routine of they were great at their job. They've been great at their job, so they got promoted to be a leader, and now they're getting promoted up, 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 potentially. And so they feel like, okay, I know what to do, and I want to protect my team. This idea of protecting, I want to protect others, or so whether it's protecting others or it's their own. Okay, I know how this is going to be done, so I'm going to have people do it because I don't want to look like a fool because my team does it the wrong way. And so it is often this protectionist mentality. And so to the flip of that, sometimes you have those leaders that, especially if you've had a micromanager, I say you have this idea of, I'm not a regular manager, I'm a cool manager. You do what you want, I trust you, I've got you. And I call these oversized sweatpants. I promised my daughter that I would say oversized sweatpants, like she's a teenager. And so she wears now these oversized sweatpants that are, at least in the States, for some reason, very, very popular. And they horrify me when I see them at the drop off at the high school. But these are the managers that say, I'm not going to have one-on-one meetings. People, you can find me if you need me. I have an open door. And often that's designed as what I call an overcorrection sometimes to that tight jeans. But this is, I'm going to give people freedom. But often what you intend as freedom, people don't have any direction. So they're winging it. They may not want to bother you. They may say, well, I know you said open door, but it feels like 7 people are trying to get in your door at the same time. And so I don't know when I can reliably get your time and direction. So you have a lot of people kind of potentially rowing in totally different directions trying to figure it out. And so in between, what I say is more of the ideal, which is cozy joggers leadership. My husband was like, well, cozy doesn't necessarily drive performance. I say, well, I'll call it structured autonomy, which isn't quite as marketable. But I do think about it as structure is very important. But this is the idea of creating a container to think about your team, whatever that looks like, including any managers reporting to you, and think, what can I do to make sure that in those moments that I'm not there by their side? Because you're not going to be, and you don't want to pretend like you're going to be or make anyone feel like you're going to be, to help them know the decisions they can make in the best way for the organization, for the goals. They can know where they find me. We have, structured time for guidance, but to really create that environment where people have support. They have a waistband. They have all of that, but they also have room to try things, take things as learning opportunities. So for me, it is a visual that I found helpful, that's resonated with leaders that say, okay, well, I don't want to be tight jeans. I also don't want to be oversized sweatpants. But I say, if you can think about that framing and pause and do that, I do think it can really help you as you think about how to communicate and the decisions to make.
Yeah, and I really like it. And I take your husband's point about cozy, but cozy is comfortable. It's you got to feel slightly at ease at work in order to be able to push the boundaries too. I mean, so I think it sets a tone that is needed. The question is, how does one do it? I mean, it's the Goldilocks, isn't it? It's not too hot, it's not too cold. It's just right, and it's easy enough to say that. How do we get managers to know where that point is, and how do you know when you've reached that point, that you're getting the balance right?
Well, I'm not going to tell people to buy the book and find out, but I
No, but buy the book and find out. Yeah.
but
I'll
I
tell
mean,
them that. Sorry.
I'll tell you a framework I put in the book as well, is as in addition to kind of these visuals, I do have a framework that's I say is a go-to for people, leaders at any level for any situation. And that is pause, consider, act. And what that means is a 3-step framework. Again, I learned from my time at McKinsey, you want to have the power of 3 is a very strong one. And so, but the idea is first is to pause. And that's when getting to some of what you said earlier is, we are in organizations. A lot of us, job descriptions may say fast-paced organization. In it, you may feel like it's always a race to reply first. And so while decisiveness and action are incredibly important in any organization, sometimes speed seems to be prioritized at the sake of just taking a pause. Sometimes it's literally a second. And so reflecting in a moment and using that pause, okay, so I'm taking a pause, I'm listening to this podcast. What do I do when I'm pausing? Is to consider. And what I mean by consider is think about, one, how would you want to be treated in a situation if it's something with a team member? So let's say you have let's say you have a manager that's reporting to you, and their team just doesn't seem to be great. They're located at a different location than you. You're going to say, I'm going to come and visit. That's fine. I'm going to step in and visit. And you show up, everything looks fine. Everything looks fine. No one's voicing anything. You think, okay, well, got to be the manager then. So, okay, we'll make a change with the manager. But in the consider phase, sometimes it's, what would you want to happen if you were on the other side of that? And what are the things you may not see? One thing I've seen from my career quilt is when a senior leader or mid-level leader or the big boss comes to visit, often all of the team is scurrying around like mice. They're trying to make everything look perfect. And they're not going to show you any cracks, again, for all those same fears that people have of job loss, of embarrassment. And so you in that mid-level leadership, it's really important to know that you're getting the real deal. And sometimes it is going to be that manager you have over that person is just not the right one for it. But sometimes it's pause to consider, okay, how can I have a conversation at the outset to say, I don't want to come and have things look perfect if they're not. I do want to understand the real deal and talk through those and figure out what's going on. And so some of that is just a pause of how you could do that in advance. The last step is to act. So you pause, you consider how would I want to be treated in a situation. Sometimes the consider is also, what's the right outcome here? Ideally you want a well-performing team. Okay, what are the ways we can back into that? Again, a lot of times that's conversations, but to act is to do something about it. Because one trap I often see people fall into, in addition to not pausing, which is a very common one, is that you tell someone, okay, I want to do this. I'm going to follow up. That's a great idea. Let me think on that. And then you move on with life. And there's never a conversation again about it. Sometimes or oftentimes I think it's because people just forget. You don't write it down, you don't record it, you don't make a note for yourself. And so that step really is to act, is to do or say something about it. And you may have these notes, you write to yourself, oh shoot, I forgot to follow up. But if you don't follow up with someone, you say you're going to do something, no matter what that level, they'll fill that silence with the worst case scenario. Oh, well, that was a ridiculous idea. Oh my, they probably shared it with their leadership meeting and everyone made fun of me. I mean, this is real human instinct. Even if your direct report is a director that's been well experienced or they're a new team member. And so acting often is whether it's following up with someone when you promise or having the conversation or making the decision that you've been putting off. And so this 3-step framework is one that often, especially with that pause, you can undo a lot of the micromanagement or the giving people so much room they don't have direction. And so that's one where I've really found people able to thread the needle of leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I really like that pause, consider, act. We've got I use a similar 3-word phrase, but in fact, it doesn't get as far as act. And I think your acting is obviously a critical part of it. I mean, I just say stop, pause, and reflect because I'm trying to get people to the reflect part. And I frequently think, stopping and pausing is essentially the same thing, but it's not quite, because I think the idea of pausing, people sort of feel that they can keep moving while they're pausing. And I think it's important to have actively stopped in order to then do the right.
I love that.
Here you go. And then to do the reflection, which is very similar to your considering. And you mentioned earlier the bit about if you've got a micromanaging boss, how it's important to probably see it from their side. And that the reason they're micromanaging is not in order to control you, it's to protect you. And I think I think that was your phrase. And it's really, that doesn't make it any less irritating to be micromanaged, but it puts an entirely different aspect on it. And I suspect, that, as you say, that the vast majority of micromanaging is done in that way, meaning to be helpful, whereas it's not. And that kind of reflection is really useful. The other great phrase that comes out of the book is your one around the 8-armed octopus wizards, and that plays to this idea of everything moving terribly fast and us all having to multitask, and we know we can't actually multitask, at least not too cognitive actions at the same time. But juggling, basically, isn't it? What's your advice for those of us who spin too many plates and have a continual background noise of small amounts of crockery crashing to the floor?
But a big part of the book is really is communication. And some of this is you feel like you're supposed to keep all of this up in the air. And this idea of the eight arm octopus wizard, what I mean is there are so many people, your teams certainly, but also sometimes senior leaders that aren't realizing always the pressures that you're dealing with. And so oftentimes people think you're a wizard. When people are talking to you, they think you know everything. You remember their name, which sometimes you're not going to be. Ideally not people on your team, but this basic information. People just think you know everything. Your team members think you know everything on their plate. The conversations that they've had, the conversations they think they've had with you that they haven't. But so they assume that you are omniscient and you know this information. And so when you make decisions and aren't communicating the why or things, they often assume malintent, which is the opposite way of how people should be. But it really is a common human trait that I think goes back to 10, 14. We live in this, we are still afraid of being, chased by mastodons, although now that comes in the form of a termination of employment or separation of employment or embarrassment. But they often think you know everything. People often also think you're an octopus. So when someone has a need, they think I need to reach out to my leader. And if you can't get back to them, they're frustrated because they think, well, they must be choosing somebody else. People don't realize how much you have at once. I remember very well when I was an in-house lawyer and my boss was the general counsel, and our offices were right next to each other. I remember he seemed so upset or about something and seemed so stressed. And like, I don't know, what he has going on. And I was over and he was like showing me an email in his inbox. And what I looked at was the volume of things coming in his inbox. Just absolutely, absolutely wild. And this was 10 plus years ago before. So totally. And it gave me a completely different perspective on what he had each day. And not to say I didn't think he had a busy job. I knew he did. But visually for me, that's stuck with me for so long. And I think so many people in leadership don't give a peek to their teams about the realities. So to just show I'm not an octopus, I'm trying to deal with things at once, but also the wizard aspect is like if you give a development opportunity or something, including to a manager or high potential team member, you may think to yourself, this is great. I'm developing them. I'm giving them something. Without context of you affirmatively saying that, people sometimes will think, well, what is this? Is this work they don't want to do? Or I have so much on my plate. They're just adding more things to it. And so what I recommend is to give those levels of context, to say, I have this opportunity. I'd love to give it to you. Let's talk about what's on your plate, what we can prioritize. Again, sometimes it's going to mean just adding to your plate. Other times you can move. But when you have those conversations, it's not soft. It's not cozy in the worst sense. What it is realistic in really providing that structure to help people not just commit to doing something, but to understand how to actually be successful and get it done.
Being able to, it's walking in other people's shoes to a great extent, isn't it? It's being able to see what, the reaction that people give to what you think is a positive or beneficial instruction or activity, and then it being interpreted, with that element of fear that we all have. You mentioned earlier that not knowing piece. That the worst time for anything is when you don't know what the outcome's going to be. Whether it's a health issue or a work issue or whatever. Once you know with a degree of certainty what it is, then you can deal with it. But it's you said when people not coming back and clarifying whatever, it's that uncertainty is the unsettling part. And equally, if we don't understand what the instruction or why the instruction's been given, there's uncertainty around that too. It is difficult though to forever be on the other side, looking back at what you're doing. I'd suggest. So a lot of that is perhaps picked up just through practice and experience. But I suppose what you're saying is we need to be sort of open to it and aware of it at the same time. Do you think it's different in different organizational sort of situations, though? In an earlier podcast that I was doing, that someone was saying that in the retail situation or anything that's sort of customer facing, so it's much easier to be a leader because you see how everyone else is operating, interacting, and if they're struggling or not. Whereas in an office environment, you don't get to see what they're doing unless you're sort of standing over their shoulder and seeing what's on the screen. And I wonder if you picked that up. I mean, we'll come back to the KFC, McKinsey, to sort of archetypes here, but have you come across that at all?
Yeah, yes, and some of that I do think is the remote work versus in person. I mean, I think plenty of retail leaders will say, "I have an incredibly hard job because I'm around my people all the time." And so I do think while things can feel hard, when you do have a connection with people, it is so much easier to build people's motivation to want to do work, to have information, to understand, to help them feel like they can open up to you. I mean, I say I've had some of the best moments of life, but also some of the worst when I've been at work, gotten news about family members with illnesses. And I remember people, being in person and consoling in person and how powerful that was. I also have been in situations where it's remote and it feels awkward because you think to yourself, do I cancel this call? Do I show up? Do I go cameras off? And so I do have aspects in the book about things, whether it's remote work or different environments, that it is going to be different. I mean, different organizations, different cultures, but truly different environments. It is gonna be a bit of a sliding scale about how you build that, and sometimes you have to be intentional. I think in remote environments where you're not having connection with people as much as possible, it's important. Some of the things I found to be so important are to affirmatively schedule one-on-one time with team members and to show up on time. Because in those remote environments, you may, but people I often hear from people like, "Oh, my boss, I have a one-on-one, but it's 30 minutes long. They show up 20 minutes late. I've been sitting there and they tell me they were just meeting with, this SVP, whatever. So all of a sudden I know my place, and so just knowing in those times how important it is to affirmatively make contact, to do basic seeming things like show up on time. And in the book, I have some of the talking points about what to say if you found other people always interrupting your time with your team members. But a lot of it really is intentionality, the power of checking in on people. I mean, ideally, even in environments where you're not together, whether you're in the office, but you're kind of working like parallel play, like toddlers, you're kind of doing your own thing, or you are remote, getting people together. I mean, ideally getting people together in person, but absent that, as a mid-level manager, you may not always get the budget for that, but doing things to build team connection. And I do have some of the ideas for that, including having meetings with other teams. Because one aspect as mid-level leaders in particular, and the way I like to phrase it is sometimes, especially let's say you're leader of a department or you're a senior leader in that department, sometimes it can feel like a bunch of us versus them across the organization. I say often thinking about your job as a mid-level leader is to be strategic and work with the other function, as difficult as that can be, depending on your colleagues and those other functions at times, or the functions that fight. And I was in legal and HR, not two of the most popular functions in any organization, but legal and sales, legal and accounting, information security and sales, these functions that seem to be at odds at each other because sales may prioritize speed. Information security prioritizes trying to stay on top of, every data and data breach and data law on top of things. And so in the book, I talk about how important it is for those leaders in those functions to get together and have real conversations about how to work together productively. And the way I put that is thinking about not just defending your team, but advocating for your team. In advocating your team and thinking within the broad organization, that's a step that I do think is really powerful for mid-level leaders. Because you do set the tone, especially for your department. And if your marketing, your legal team has always been at odds at each other, you would certainly not be alone, but you can be the ones that transform it from feeling like us versus them to helping really come up with creative ideas. That is some of what mid-level leaders can do that is very powerful and has very, very strong ripple effects.
No, I like that. And the word you use there around intentionality. I mean, a lot of good leadership is about being intentional about what you're doing, which comes from that pause, consider, act. But it's not just doing what is inside you and you think feels right. It's having thought it through and understood why you're doing it. And that takes a degree of self-discipline and self-knowledge that often only can come with experience. And in the heat of the moment, in the noise of every day, that can be really difficult to do. And I think that's probably what sets the people who do it really well apart from the rest, is they know why they're doing what they're doing and they've thought it through. So I really like that. But it's a muscle that you need to attend to. It's a muscle that you need to exercise and work at. Otherwise, it goes. All of this, all of what you discuss in the manager method, it is in a way exercises for keeping that muscle alive. Would that be right?
I'm trying to. I mean, that's what. So it's still towards the beginning of the year. I know that for those that like Curb Your Enthusiasm, Larry David would be horrified at anyone saying Happy New Year earlier on. We're going to be, into February or so when this comes out. But you can, if you made a vow to a resolution to exercise, you can read the book, but listening to the podcast, really building that muscle. Those are all things that are investing of time, and that is intentionality. And then the question is, how do you bring it to life? So in the book on my site, managermethod.com/book, I do have resources for self-reflection and also a book club guide. So if you're reading this with others on the leadership team, if you're looking for something to bring the leadership team and say, hey, I have this guide, we can do this, then and build those relationships with functions, you can find those for free as well.
Superb. Well, I encourage people to do that, absolutely, because it's absolutely the philosophy of us here at Ideas for Leaders and the Power Between that these things are not hugely complicated to do, but you need to keep practicing them. And the challenge, I think, for organizations is to create the space and structure where people can do that pausing and considering and then acting. Because in the normal course of our very busy lives, we don't get those opportunities don't just emerge in front of us, that we have to create. So I'm delighted this set of exercises for us to follow through on. Ashley, it's been superb to talk to you. Thank you very much. I will put the links through to the book in the show notes, and people can pick up on that. But in the meantime, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you so much, Roddy. Appreciate you having me on.